Well, for a couple of weeks, we're going to deal with Malachi. My hunch is that few of us have ever read Malachi, and if we read it, it probably didn't have much of an impact on our lives. But it's a fascinating a book. Now, it's placed in the last of the list of prophets in the Bible as we know it. But it's important to note the difference between the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible when it comes to Malachi. Because in both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, it's the last one of the prophets. But in the Hebrew Bible, you have the section of the prophets, and then you have the wisdom literature at the end of the Hebrew Bible. But in the Christian Bible, the Christian leaders changed the order of the Old Testament books and put the prophets last. And so you end up with the prophets of Malachi as a sort of a bridge to the New Testament. I think biblical scholars would all agree that placing the prophets last was an intentional placement to emphasize that the message of the preachers foreshadowed the teachings of Jesus. And that is what we've been doing for the past few months together, is sort of unpacking how the message of the prophets foreshadowed the teachings of Jesus. And so Malachi is the last of these prophets. Now, we don't have any biographical information on Malachi. The name Malachi means my messenger, but we don't know anything more about it, except it was in the post-exilic time, because we know from reading the book that the temple had been rebuilt. So the exiles, most of the exiles from Babylon and Egypt and those in Palestine, they were reunited in Palestine, and they rebuilt the temple. And also there's a reference to the Judea being a republic, which probably puts them in the time of the Persian Empire, which was immediately, the Persian Empire was the empire that allowed the exiles to return to Palestine. And so that's the historic context. We know nothing about the prophet himself, but it's a fascinating book because it's really an argumentative narrative. It's just a good argument between God and people. And that's the way the book is put together. Now, there's 6 subjects of the argument with God. The first 2 of them has to do with Malachi's message to the priests. And remember, the priests, they were responsible for performing the rituals of religion that attempt to get to God. And the first 2 arguments with God had to do with messages for the priests. It had to do with love and respect. And in the first verse of chapter 2, the priests are to be disciplined in this argument. And now this commandment is for you, O priests. If you do not listen, and if you do not take it to heart and give honor to my name, says the Lord of hosts, then I'll send a curse upon you. And so the first 2 arguments with God sort of centered in terms of the unfaithfulness of the priests, the boredom of the priests, if you will. But then the last 4 arguments don't have anything to do with the priests. They have to do with the people of Israel. And Malachi's message to the people had to do with profaning the covenant of not heeding God's justice, of how they handle scarcity and abundance, the whole value in serving God. These were the subjects of the argument that Malachi presented between God and God's people. And so you have the first two dealing with love and respect, sort of the arguments that centered on the life of the priests. And you have the last four arguments centered on the relationship of God and the people. And the arguments are sort of as a parent with the child. And you get an underlying message as you read Malachi. And by the way, Malachi is at best 3 pages long. And so it's a very short book, and one that you can read quickly after you listen to this presentation. But the underlying message for Malachi was, as Malachi looked back at the 700 years of what was happening with the nation Israel, the establishment always believed that God would really reward the faithful. And here were people that rebuilt the temple. And they felt like in rebuilding the temple that was an act of faithfulness for which they would be rewarded. But they had returned to Palestine. They had rebuilt the temple. But even that, Malachi says, the priests and the people have continued to be unfaithful through carelessness, through boredom, through abuse of liturgy, through contamination of the community. And he mentions intermarriage outside of the Hebrew community. And so this is sort of the underlying theme. And the best description of Malachi that I can come up with is that over the centuries, the preachers had been sometimes defended the establishment, but more often offended the establishment. And after all of these centuries, questions still remain. If you will, it's the book of unfinished business. It's a book of sort of emptiness, if you will, because after all these centuries, we still have these questions. And let me just read these questions that are spaced throughout Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord, but you say, how hast thou loved us? Good question. And then we have the question, do we not all have the same Father? Has not one God created us? Why then do you deal treacherously, each against his brother? Why? Later on in 2:15, but not one has done, so who has a remnant of the Spirit? And what did that one do while he was seeking a godly offspring? Then, verse 17, chapter 2. You have wearied the Lord with your words. Yet you say, how have we wearied him? Another question in 3, 7, and 8. From the days of your fathers you have turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. But you say, how shall we return? So again and again, these questions become the heart of Malachi's message. The questions are focused on the priests, the questions that focus on the people. And when you think of Malachi raising all these questions after all these years of Israel trying to get it right, what a prelude that is to the life and teachings of Jesus. For the Christian community to take one of these latter prophets and use that message as the last message in the Old Testament. So the Christians put that there so they could say, and here's Jesus in the New Testament. Now, there's one very significant, almost new emerging theme in Malachi that we must lift up. And that is the beloved community. As I read in chapter 2, verse 10, it has to do, faithfulness has to do with each other. You see, Deuteronomy 6:4 was the new law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and might and soul. Period. But Malachi seems to indicate that something is lacking there. That the covenant must also be with one another. And the seeds are sown in Malachi for the whole understanding of the beloved community. And we'll deal with that hook, line, and sinker next week when we deal with Malachi and Jesus. But we must lift it up now, because sort of at the end of the journey, according to the Christian leaders who put their Bible together, Malachi leaves these unanswered questions with the understanding that maybe something is happening even in the second law of Deuteronomy 6:4 that we all have cherished, but maybe it's lacking. Our relationship to one another is as important as our relationship with God. And indeed, they might be the same. So that's Malachi. Fascinating book. Prelude to the New Testament according to the Christians who put the Bible and the order of the books together. But it leaves us with some questions to think about and visit about on Sunday. The first question that it raises for me is, what is the difference between faith that is based on questions rather than faith being based on answers? What's the difference between the two? Secondly, personally, as the foundation of your faith journey and my faith journey, is the certainty of law more or less attractive than the ambiguity of love? Finally, where do we observe the evidence or the existence today of the beloved community? I think in dealing with those questions, we see the relevance of Malachi for today. We look forward to Sunday.